This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. Liberals. It's time we had a little grown-up to liberal talk about the facts of life. Specifically, I'd like to answer a question that may have been on your minds recently. Where does money come from? Now, it's perfectly natural for someone at your pre-adolescent stage of development to ask this question. And even though it may be awkward to talk about, it's important you get the answer from a conservative or other adult. Otherwise, you might be told schoolyard lies.
You're telling me we got to go spend money to keep from going bankrupt? The answer, yeah, it's what I'm telling you.
Or old wives' tales.
Unemployment insurance, the economists tell us, return $2 for every dollar that is put out there for unemployment insurance.
Or a lot of superstitious, puritanical nonsense that'll only make you feel unnecessarily guilty.
I mean, I do think at a certain point you've made enough money.
You see, money is a lot like the birds and the bees. That is, it's a symbol for something else. What's it a symbol for? Well, let's say a bee wants to put his pollen in a flower. But unfortunately for the bee, the flower would rather have a flat-screen TV. The bird has a flat-screen TV, for some reason, but wants to trade it for a signed photograph of Mila Kunis. The squirrel has saved up a stack of Mila photos, because he's a squirrel, but he wants honey. The bee, who's really pissed off at this point, has the honey. Now, rather than going through an elaborate circle of barter that would limit the ways in which all the animals could have, intercourse, the little creatures use money as a symbol of what someone wanted from them and what they want from someone else. That's right, money is a symbol for desire. Now, don't be embarrassed. Desire is perfectly natural. In fact, people naturally desire more and more. They even lust desperately after things that didn't exist at all a few short years ago, like iPhones or cholesterol medicine, or Mila Kunis for that matter, who of course is not for sale. That's why there can be more and more money for everyone who does something or makes something that other people desire. This desire, as you may know, comes out of a secret part of us we don't like to expose. So there's only one way to figure out what we desire and how much, and that's by offering things for sale and finding out what, if anything, people are willing to pay for them. We call that the free market, because we can't find out what we desire if people fix the market prices or force us to buy one thing rather than another. Since everyone uses the market, we all chip in some money to the government to provide roads so we can get to market, soldiers and police to protect the market, and a few rules to make sure everyone at the market plays fair. But remember, your desire is very private and personal to you, so no one, even the government, has the right to touch it unless you want them to. They don't have the right to take it away from you and give it to someone else just because that's where they think it should go.
I think when you spread the wealth around, it's good for everybody.
They don't have a right to use it for things that they want, but you don't.
High-speed trains.
Universal health care.
Green jobs. Cash for clunkers.
And they don't have a right to tell you where you should put it, symbolically speaking. I'm glad we could have this little talk, and I hope you'll remember, if ever someone from the government tries to put his hands on your money, run away as fast as you can and tell the nearest conservative. The conservative is your friend. My thanks to City Journal's wonderful Nicole Gelinas for helping me with this video. Read her book, After the Fall, Saving Capitalism from Wall Street and Washington. You might also want to read How an Economy Grows and Why It Crashes by Peter D. Schiff and Andrew J. Schiff. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. There are many mysteries that trouble the human mind. How did the universe come into being? Why is there evil? What the hell are women always complaining about? But of all of these conundrums, the most baffling enigma is surely this. Why do black people vote for Democrats? Today, the terrifying answer. The Democrat Party has always been the party of racism. Fortunately, in 1850, men of conscience opposed to slavery formed a new party, the Republicans. The Republicans chose as their leader Abraham Lincoln, who had risen to fame after inventing the $5 bill. Lincoln wrote powerful speeches denouncing slavery, which he posted on the walls of the Greek temple in which he lived, for some reason, until his leadership in the Civil War brought the unholy institution to an end. After the war, Democrats throughout the South passed so-called Jim Crow laws, which effectively stripped blacks of the freedoms won for them by their Republican allies. And yet, bizarrely, in 1912, many African Americans deserted the Republicans to help elect Democrat President Woodrow Wilson, a virulent racist who allowed the Jim Crow laws to spread to the federal government. By the middle of the 20th century, Democrat segregationists like George Wallace, Orville Forbes, and Bull Connor were defending the Jim Crow laws against the growing civil rights movement. As late as the 50s and mid-60s, Democrats like Lyndon Johnson, Sam Ervin, and Al Gore Sr. opposed civil rights legislation while Republicans overwhelmingly supported it. For more on this, check out the excellent book Demonic by Ann Coulter. Holy smokes, would you look at the gams on that tomato? Sorry. It's a Democrat tradition that Richard Nixon won the racist South for Republicans with his famous Southern strategy. Another Democrat tradition is lying. In fact, Nixon was a powerful and effective supporter of desegregation and civil rights. Likewise, the Reagan administration brought greater economic gains to blacks than any other racial group, and the law and order policies of Republican New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani saved thousands of African American lives. Yet Nixon, Reagan, and Giuliani are all derided as racist, while blacks continue to vote for Democrats whose policies have destroyed their neighborhoods and families alike. Why? Klavan on the Culture's crack team of investigative reporters working around the clock have managed to steal the work of Walter Russell Mead and Michael Barone to uncover a clue to the terrifying answer. Over the last 10 years, the U.S. Census shows blacks have been migrating in droves from failed Democrat-led urban centers to successful areas governed by Republicans. The implication is inescapable. There is a massive African-American conspiracy to take revenge on America for its past racism by electing Democrats and then quickly escaping their crappy policies. Under this diabolically clever plan, blacks have helped elect Democrats to lay economic and social waste to areas like Baltimore, Detroit, Chicago, and Compton, and then have snuck away to thriving Republican areas where there are still some jobs and affordable housing. Today, we at Klavan on the Culture want to send out this desperate plea. Black people, we weren't even born during slavery days. Most of us weren't around for Jim Crow. Have mercy. Stop voting for Democrats. Please, have mercy. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. In an effort to bring peace to the Middle East, President Barack Obama has proposed that Israel should return to its 1967 borders in exchange for being annihilated by its enemies. This would be an extension of the brilliant 2005 trade-off in which Israel gave up control of the Gaza Strip in return for being relentlessly attacked by rocket fire, while Palestinians voted to give leadership in the territory to Hamas, a terrorist organization bent on Jewish genocide. But enticing as this offer may be, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has subtly indicated his displeasure with the president's idea by flying to Washington and carefully explaining to Obama the meaning of the ancient biblical phrase, Kish mir Yiddish Tukis. This creates a major obstacle in achieving the so-called two-state solution, a proposal that would bring about lasting peace by dividing the area fairly between the Israelis and those who have sworn to exterminate them if it's the last thing they ever do. That's why today, we here at Klavan on the Culture would like to lay out what we consider the only plan likely to bring tranquility, freedom, and justice to the region. The one-state solution, in which the entire Middle East is given to the Jews. That's right. The one-state solution is a proposal of genius that would not only help the Palestinians, but would instantly achieve the noblest goals of the so-called Arab Spring. For instance, Turning the entire Middle East into one big Israel will secure religious freedom for everyone in the area. As things stand, Muslim states either ban other religions completely or torment their practitioners to the point of extinction. Not so Israel. Although Jimmy Carter and other leftists pretending not to be anti-Semites have accused Israel of practicing religious apartheid, the fact is Muslims and Christians have full freedom of religion in the Jewish state. They can and do vote and serve in the Israeli parliament and Supreme Court. They can and do volunteer to serve in the Israeli Defense Forces. And only under the Jews are the religious sites of the Holy Land open to all. Indeed, once the entire Middle East becomes Israel, most of the region's Arabs will be freer and better off in every way than they've ever been before. The United Nations reports that Israel is far more democratic and more advanced in human development than any Arab state. And of course, only in Israel is that half of the population sometimes known as women, or sweetheart, or baby, given full human rights. Handing control of the Middle East over to the Jews is such a terrific idea. In fact, many of you may be thinking, hey, maybe the Jews should run America too. Of course, some anti-Semites believe the Jews already run America, but that's ridiculous. If the Jews ran America, we wouldn't be $14 trillion in debt. Knuckleheads. For more information on Israel, try searching the subject on Front Page Magazine at frontpagemag.com. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. Today, Klavan on The Culture offers a brief course of sensitivity training in how to behave during an Islamic massacre. You see, people tend to act according to their beliefs, and in our global multicultural society, we have to learn to get along with those who have different beliefs and therefore act differently than we do. For instance, in the past, when juvenile attention seekers desecrated Christian religious objects by displaying a crucifix and a glass of urine, say, or smearing dung on an image of the Virgin Mary, or filming a crucifix with ants crawling over it, Christians in America protested by demanding these images cease to receive public funding. Similarly, when juvenile attention seeker Terry Jones recently burned a copy of the Quran, Muslims in Afghanistan protested by slaughtering and beheading more than 20 innocent people. This subtle difference between Christian and Islamic modes of communication can cause misunderstandings and make it difficult for Christians to respond in a sensitive and unprejudiced way. So, here are some tips. First, abandon all your principles. Defending ideals like individual liberty and freedom of expression can be offensive to others and dangerous to yourself. Instantly discarding not only your own beliefs, but those that uphold Western culture specifically and human dignity in general can save time by eliminating unnecessary intermediate steps like pretending all religions are equally sound or pasting a coexist bumper sticker on your sad, wimpy little car. Let's watch as Senator Lindsey Graham demonstrates how to throw your principles overboard.
Free speech is a great idea, but we're in a war.
Here's another tip. Holding homicidal Muslims responsible for their savage brutality will only annoy them and could cause you to be accused of Islamophobia, the irrational fear of being decapitated. Instead of blaming Muslims for their actions, try to treat them as subhumans with no moral agency. If they had no choice but to go on a kill spree, the only real fault lies with the man who provoked them. Here's Joe Klein of Time magazine showing the way by writing about Quran burner Terry Jones. Jones's act was murderous as any suicide bomber's. Note how Klein assumes the Muslims' bloodthirsty response to Jones was inevitable, as if Muslims were uncontrollable beasts with no wills of their own. This assumption allows Klein to morally equate Jones's crude and unkind act with Muslim mass murder and display his own sensitivity and open-mindedness to mass murder. We all must learn that confronting evil can lead to violence. With just a little intellectual dishonesty and some unprincipled sniveling, we can put an end to Islamic slaughters peacefully by eliminating their cause, our freedom. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. Once upon a time, there was an enchanted place called Imaginationland, where everything was just as wonderful as you could make believe it was. There were no evil religions in Imaginationland because to say there were would have been hateful. Men and women were equal in everything because it was mean to say they weren't. And no matter what they did to their children, the kids were all right because otherwise their parents would have felt guilty. And of course, there was always enough money to pay for everything everyone wanted here, because if there hadn't been, it wouldn't have been fair. Now, one day to Imaginationland, there came a magic suit of clothes named Barack. Although no one could prove he had ever been born, whenever anyone asked him his opinion on difficult issues, he always said present, so he must have been there. His closest associates were hate-mongers, terrorists, and racketeers, and yet he never did anything wrong, because no one would say he had. And though the magic suit had never accomplished a single thing of importance, in Imaginationland he was able to take the shape of some of the greatest men the country had ever produced. Not only that, he had the power to do amazing things. He must have had, because he said he would.
This was the moment when the rise of the oceans began to slow and our planet began to heal. When there's a bill that ends up on my desk as president, you, the public, will have 5 days to look online and find out what's in it before I sign it. I have ordered the closing of the detention center at Guantanamo Bay.
We have already identified $2 trillion in deficit reductions that will help us cut our deficit in half by the end of my first term.
So wonderful was the magic suit that the people of Imaginationland made him their president. And everyone was happy. Good job, magic suit, they said. Good job. But one day, as Barack the magic suit was walking through the cheering throngs of his admirers, a terrible voice came out of the radio. The voice said, "Wait, wait, the magic suit has quadrupled the deficit. He raised the debt more in 2 years than it was raised in the previous 8. Unemployment remains staggeringly high. Gas prices are out of control. House prices are tanking. The health care plan is a horrible mess. Our foreign policy is weak and chaotic. Our laws are being unfairly enforced, and our Constitution unconscionably ignored. Look, look, everyone," said the radio voice. "The magic suit isn't wearing any president." A hush fell over the crowd. Everyone was shocked. But suddenly, first one, then another of the people began to shout. And they shouted louder and louder until no one could hear the radio anymore. And everyone was happy again, because this was Imaginationland. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. Guerrilla filmmaker James O'Keefe has released another of his Project Veritas video stings, exposing the mind-boggling corruption, arrogance, and bigotry that permeate America's institutional left. In the current video, 2 Project Veritas actors pretend to be radical Muslims, offering a $5 million donation to a pair of all-too-willing executives from National Public Radio. There's Ron Schiller, Senior Vice President in charge of NPR's Division of Supercilious Contempt.
The current Republican Party is not really the Republican Party. It's been hijacked by this group that is... The radical, racist, Islamophobic, Tea Party people. And not just Islamophobic, but...
Several NPR executives have been forced to resign because of the video, including the director of speaking very softly to suggest elite status, the senior vice president in charge of boring musical interludes, and the programming executive for twee self-satisfied humor. The exposure of NPR's leftist prejudice, patronizing scorn for the majority of Americans, and casual anti-Semitism caught the last remaining 6 New York Times readers by surprise. But it did raise an interesting question. In a country of endless broadcasting options, why should Americans be forced to pay the salaries of a tiny cabal of left-wing Thurston Howell III impersonators?
But the whole thing sounds so darn democratic.
Who want to play at being journalists and entertainers? Well, as always, leftists provide an answer to that question through careful reasoning devoid of emotionalism. They say defunding public broadcasting would be like killing Big Bird. To counter this argument, Klavan on the Culture's Project Clavitas has done a courageous video sting of our own. We used a hidden camera to record a secret meeting between Big Bird and his Sesame Street crony, Elmo. Here are the results.
Those Tea Party Americans sure are racist, Elmo.
Elmo hates Tea Party. They want to bring back yucky Constitution.
I know. And they want people to be able to keep their own money instead of having the government use it the way it's supposed to.
Greedy, greedy, greedy.
And some of them even believe in Jesus.
Elmo hates Jesus. He not let me tear baby out of mommy and cut it to pieces.
And they're mean to our friends Hamas just because they want to kill Jews.
Kill Jews, kill Jews, kill. All right. That wasn't really Big Bird and Elmo talking. That was me. Because Big Bird and Elmo are just puppets. Somebody has to talk for them. And I think we all know who that somebody is. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. Today, we take an inspiring look at your public sector unions at work. Everywhere you turn these days, your public sector unions are hard at work protesting cutbacks to public sector unions.
Bunch of wimps, bunch of sissies!
Every once in a while, you gotta get out of the streets and get a little bloody when necessary.
This guy's making threats now. He says he's gonna break my neck.
One lawmaker looked out at the crowds gathered in the Wisconsin Capitol today and said it's like Cairo moved to Madison.
That's right. The public sector union protests are just like the protests against tyrants in the Middle East, because elected American officials working to reform public sector unions are like Middle Eastern tyrants in the sense that in order to appreciate our public sector unions as they deserve, let's take a look at how they operate. In the private sector, you have an employer who creates wealth and pays his workers for their labor out of that wealth. If the employer is greedy or cheap and pays unfairly, the workers may organize into a union. The union can then demand higher and higher pay and benefits until the employer goes out of business and is thus taught an important lesson about being nice, while all his now unemployed workers enjoy a hearty laugh at his discomfiture. But with a public sector union, the employer is you, the taxpayer. And the public sector unions you pay for are so effective that not only do their workers have greater job security than you, their salary and benefits are also often much higher. Now, you may say, hey, wait a minute. If I'm paying the public sector worker, how can he make more than I do? Well, the reason is there are a lot more ordinary people than there are public workers. So each person can pay part of the public worker's higher salary, just as there are more ordinary people than princes and kings. So the princes and kings can wear fur and jewels while the ordinary people starve. You see, unlike private workers who may be constrained by market forces, public workers, by definition, provide essential public services with no competition. The only real negotiating power you, their employer, have is the power to vote in a governor who will stand up to them in negotiations. But wait, public sector union contributions help elect the governor, so your negotiator may be beholden to them. If your governor gives more of your money to the union has more money to help re-elect your governor. More and more of your money for more and more re-elections, until you have no more money, and then the governor raises the workers' pensions, because by the time the workers collect their pensions, the governor will be out of office anyway. Now, when the bill for those pensions does come due and you have no money to pay it, the public sector union worker takes to the street in protests, because protesting magically creates more money. What a great system. I hope this has explained why we should support our protesting public sector union workers. You. Because if we don't, they'll hurt us. For more information about public sector unions, read Obama and America's Public Sector Plague by E.J. McMahon and Shakedown by Stephen Malanga. They're both colleagues of mine at the City Journal, which has more public union information at city-journal.org. This is Andrew Klavan on the Culture. This is Andrew Klavan on the Culture. German Chancellor Angela Merkel, British Prime Minister David Cameron, and French President Nicolas Sarkozy have all declared that multiculturalism is a failure. What could these strange little Europeans possibly mean? And why do they all talk so funny? Let's explore. Multiculturalism is the philosophy that every culture is morally valid, and no one culture has the right to impose its values on another. Thus, if someone escapes their hellhole of a country and comes to your country to enjoy its freedoms, they shouldn't be forced to learn and accept the principles and customs on which those freedoms stand, but should instead be allowed to retain the charming native language, religion, and manners that turned their country into a hellhole in the first place. This system helps to avoid the cultural chauvinism implied by assimilation, and instead gives you a warm sense of your own open-minded tolerance right up until the moment your immigrants strap on the delightful explosives of their beloved homeland and in their quaint little way blow you to pieces. From broad-minded ancient writers like Herodotus, through canny conquerors like Alexander the Great and Augustus Caesar, to the all-embracing genius of Jesus Christ, tolerant acceptance of different cultures has evolved into a central Western value. Other cultures don't have that value of tolerance, so we have to tolerate their intolerance and let them kill us. This applies abroad as well as at home. For instance, let's say a person is homosexual and lives in a Western nation where by and large straight people tolerate gay people, or in England where it's the other way around. If he visits, say, Iran, where they hang homosexuals, then that would be right for their culture, and courtesy demands he participate in the local scene by being executed. Of course, if he merely flies over Iran in international airspace, Iranian culture wouldn't apply. Unless their culture doesn't recognize international airspace, in which case he probably should have gone around. Multiculturalism is based on the equally sound philosophy of moral relativism, which holds that nothing is absolutely right or wrong, except that nothing is absolutely right or wrong. As Shakespeare put it, there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Actually, Shakespeare gave those words to Hamlet, who was pretending to be insane when he said them, which is to imply that moral relativism isn't just crazy, it's fake crazy, because no one's really crazy enough to believe it. So perhaps now we've begun to understand. This is Andrew Klavan on the Culture. This is Andrew Klavan on the Culture. We've been hearing a lot in the news media lately about right-wing hatred and incivility. This is the same right-wing hatred that was discussed in the media in 1963 after President John F. Kennedy was assassinated by a left-winger. It's the same right-wing incivility that led a vast right-wing conspiracy to accuse President Clinton of vile sexual predation merely because he'd been vile and sexually predatory. During the administration of George W. Bush, this right-wing hatred and incivility grew so intolerable that left-wing novelists, movie makers, and artists were compelled to depict W's assassination, while Democratic Senate leader Harry Reid publicly called the president a loser and a liar. Today, the fresh upsurge of right-wing hatred and incivility has moved Democratic Tennessee Congressman Steve Cohen to compare his Republican colleagues to Nazis on the House floor, while Democratic Virginia Congressman Jim Moran compared Americans who voted Republican to slaveholding racists. Clearly, this right-wing hatred has got to stop before Democrats kill somebody. Now, you may ask, Klavan on the Culture, in a country where conservatives are routinely branded fascist for wanting more liberty, or called racist for wanting people to be treated equally, or where even a passing reference to Sarah Palin has the same effect on a leftist that a cross has on a vampire, or on a leftist, in a country where only conservative thinkers like Ann Coulter and David Horowitz have to bring bodyguards to their campus speaking engagements because they're constantly under threat of violence, why is the news media talking about right-wing hatred and incivility instead of the ceaseless cascade of rage, meanness, and po-faced slander that comes not only from the fringe loonies of the left, like Michael Moore or Barack Obama, but from its central figures in government, academia, and the entertainment industry? Well, the reason is that somewhere between 85 and 4,000% of all so-called mainstream media journalists are openly left-wing Democrats. The rest live in secrecy and silence, scuttling from shadow to shadow in constant fear their leftism will be exposed. The result is a cloistered leftist news media elite who can only experience the reasoned refutation of their failed ideas as somehow malevolent or unkind. And I say, screw 'em. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. As everyone knows, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But why? I mean, it's the road to hell. Shouldn't it be paved with bad intentions, or flaming bricks, or copies of the New York Times? Or maybe the steaming entrails of communists and Nazis? That'd be cool. But no, it's good intentions all the way down. Just look. This stretch here was paved by environmentalists. They have wonderful intentions of using the planet more wisely and keeping it clean. And yet, their ban on DDT has contributed to some 50 million deaths from malaria. Their requirements for lighter cars have upped traffic fatalities. Their superstitious prejudice against fossil fuels has led them to thwart Western oil development, thus helping to enrich tyrants and terrorists. Even their irritating new restrictions on light bulbs will send industry from the West to China, where it'll create more environmental problems than the bulbs themselves. All told, environmentalist policies have probably led to more human misery than all the polluters in history combined. Whoa. Heck of a job, greenies. Now, here's a stretch of road made by the social justice crowd. Among other things, they wanted to rectify America's past ill treatment of blacks. There's a good intention. Instead, their family-destroying welfare entitlements and lenient approaches to crime helped ravage urban black neighborhoods with fraud, violence, and a plague of illegitimacy that virtually guaranteed generations of poverty. Not to mention their attempts to grow government and redistribute wealth, which nearly always killed jobs, innovation, and human liberty. Going down party time. We're on a highway to hell now. Here's an 8-lane stretch built by the multiculturalists. They intended to atone for colonialism and lift up the lesser nations. Instead, they've ended up encouraging the worst in human society, as when they excuse and appease violent jihadis, which in turn isolates and weakens decent Muslims. They've also damaged and perverted Western education, undermining our commitment to the most tolerant culture on earth, our own. Well, multiculturalists, imagine there's no heaven, because for you, there probably isn't. Now, some people think such good intentions lead to hell because they're really only a mask for power hunger, greed, and corruption. But let's leave George Soros aside. Maybe the trouble is that good intentions make people feel good about themselves. So good, they don't really care where their road is going as long as the good feelings continue right to the end of the line. Taxi. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. As the new year begins, I hear you asking, what do we mean by our culture? Maybe that was just me. In any case, Western culture began with the democracy in ancient Athens. There, since Christianity hadn't started yet, everyone was gay. As a result, theater thrived, including the groundbreaking production of Sophocles' Antigone, which dramatized an extraordinary question. Does an individual have a natural right to defy the power of the state in order to obey the gods? Unfortunately, there were very few Jews in Athens at the time, so no one actually went to the theater, and Antigone folded out of town. There were Jews, however, in Jerusalem. One of them, Jesus of Nazareth, seemed to many to personify the presence of their one God, lending to individual man an authority and worth that superseded the prerogatives of both church and state. Church and state celebrated the joyous revelation with their traditional banquet, followed by a crucifixion, a clever plan to make sure Jesus' philosophy would never spread. Now, within the crucible of the Roman Empire, Jesus-inspired Christianity united the visions of Athens and Jerusalem, giving Western man the raw materials he needed to understand the imperative of individual liberty. He also had the raw materials he needed to invent the light bulb, but he didn't do that either. Instead, Rome was overrun by savage tribes who spent the next 1,500 years slaughtering one another while working out the ramifications of Christian loving-kindness. This blood-soaked melee was known as Europe, and despite all its wars and persecutions and French people, it managed to create the single greatest culture the globe has ever known. Bach and Mozart, Shakespeare and Dante, Leonardo and Michelangelo, Descartes and Newton, a culture whose spirit informed the astounding moment in 1776 when the most brilliant group of political thinkers ever born gathered in Philadelphia to declare, individual man has a God-given authority and worth that supersedes the prerogatives of both church and state. Why didn't we think of that before? Thus began the United States of America, which led the Western world to its freest and most prosperous era yet, and whose story continues to this day. I think. Actually, I'll have to get back to you on that. So stay tuned to PJTV for this year's Klavan on the Culture. This is Andrew Klavan on the Culture. Today, in a hard-hitting expose, we're going to take a look at a form of religious hatred that has become rife here in America. I'm speaking, of course, about Satanophobia, bigotry against Satan worshipers. One of this nation's founding principles is freedom of worship, And yet every day throughout the land, people feel justified in speaking insensitively of the Prince of Darkness, as if he were, you know, the Prince of Darkness. This sort of calling things what they are has got to stop, especially when it comes to religion. How would it be if we went around saying, for instance, that the madmen who murdered 3,000 people on September 11th were inspired by their religion?
You're outraged about Muslims killing us on 9/11.
That's right. Whoopi and Joy would walk off their own show and stand around in the green room. Then we would have no Whoopi or Joy, because without Joy, there can be no Whoopi. That's why Americans are joining together to protect our minds from this sort of unbridled descriptive behavior. For instance, we're all willing to show our TNA to the TSA and even the other way around, to keep from pointing out that while most Muslims, of course, aren't terrorists, most terrorists right now are in fact Muslims. Exactly. No Whoopi, no Joy. Likewise, when a Sharia imperialist like Ayman Faisal Abdul Rauf spearheads an effort to build a triumphalist mosque near Ground Zero, we all chip in to pretend he's a moderate and to support this despicably unkind behavior in order to avoid saying that the mosque is inappropriate because the 9/11 massacre was committed by radical Muslims. And there they go again. The point is, religions are sacred. Otherwise, they wouldn't be called religions. They would be called systems of metaphysical ideas that can be discussed, criticized, and even ridiculed by free people with free minds. And we wouldn't want that. No civilized person would defend desecrating Christian symbols, for instance, or go around attacking Christians for their opinions about homosexual marriage. Of course not. So, if we can protect other religions from the insult of free thinking, argument, discussion, and mockery, surely we shouldn't allow this rampant and open bigotry against devil worship. Satanism, after all, is the religion of peace. Okay, maybe it's the religion of unspeakable evil. But is unspeakable evil really so bad?
There's something, Doctor, please help her.
Sure, occasionally you get the odd little girl here and there twisted into excruciating contortions as her soul is forcibly dragged into eternal hellfire. But the vast majority of little girls are going about their lives in peace and growing into healthy adult women with disgustingly curvaceous shapes that must be hidden away to keep me from falling into lustful desire and sin. What was I saying? Oh yeah, look. Most people who worship Satan are harmless, innocent drunks and perverts who probably can't even work up the energy to commit the sort of sexual atrocities and human sacrifices their religion calls for. And yet millions of Americans think nothing of gathering together in so-called churches where they openly sing the praises of Satan's sworn enemy. How would they like it if someone worshiped the sworn enemy of their God, namely Satan? Now, some of you in the audience may be saying, Klavan on the Culture, that's unfair. You say we shouldn't criticize religions, yet there you are, criticizing Christianity for worshiping the anti-satanic deity of goodness and love. Well, who asked you what you think? Stupid audience. We must understand that if we're going to commit ourselves to multicultural sensitivity, then all forms of worship must be treated with equal respect, including the worship of absolute evil. Because if all religions are good, then evil is good. So, hooray for Satan. It's satire. I'm kidding, right? We all know that Satan is bad. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. In the wake of the recent midterm elections, we here at Klavan on The Culture are asking ourselves one question. What's wrong with the American people? Now, whenever I'm faced with an important question like what's wrong with the American people, or what's for dinner, or where do babies come from, I know I can always turn for wisdom to America's political, intellectual, and entertainment elites. After all, why would they call them elites if they weren't smarter, better, and wiser than the rest of us? If they were called elites, but in fact were, say, shallow or corrupt or personally immoral or intellectually deficient, then they wouldn't be elites. They would just be a privileged pack of self-deceived, self-important, and arrogant buffoons. And I can't accept that, or life would lose its meaning. So yes, when I ask the question, what's wrong with the American people, I turn for answers to our elites, and what do you know? Answers are what I find. For instance, elite President Barack Obama says that what's wrong with the American people is that they're afraid, and the fear has made them unreasonable. Part of the reason that our politics seems so tough right now, and facts and science and argument does not seem to be winning the day all the time, is because we're hardwired not to always think clearly when we're scared, the president says. And the country is scared. We're not only scared, unreasonable, and unscientific, we're uninformed, says elite Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts. We're in a period of know-nothingism in the country, he says.
We have an electorate that doesn't always pay that much attention to what's going on. So, you know, people are influenced by a simple slogan rather than by the facts and the truth or what's happening.
But it's not just that we're scared, unreasonable, unscientific, uninformed, and inattentive. We're stupid, according to comedian Bill Maher, who must also be an elite because he has a show on HBO and sneers when he talks.
The people are too stupid to be governed.
Of course, it's one thing to be scared, unreasonable, unscientific, uninformed, inattentive, and stupid. Actually, that's 6 things. But it's a 7th thing to be downright mean, and that's the diagnosis of First Lady Michelle Obama. The nation's chief law officer, Attorney General Eric Holder, meanwhile, says America is a nation of cowards when it comes to discussing race. Oh, and speaking of race, editorialists at the elite New York Times have suggested that the majority of Americans who oppose Obama's health care bill and who support Arizona's attempts to protect its borders are racist. So, what's wrong with the American people? According to our elites, the American people are scared, unreasonable, unscientific, uninformed, inattentive, stupid, cowardly, mean, and racist. That's the only way to explain the fact that we didn't vote for the people supported by the elites. Unless it's that the elites despise us and call us names and think they're smarter than we are, even though there's no evidence of that, nor any achievement they can point to that has made our lives better than they were before they took office. In fact, things are worse and cost more. And their so-called science and facts turn out just to be schoolroom theories that don't work in reality. And their massive government impinges on our freedoms and goes against the principles our founders fought for. And Michelle Obama dresses badly. And Barack Obama can't even pronounce the word corpsman.
Navy corpsman.
And thinks Austrian is a language.
I don't know what the term is in Austrian.
So maybe they're stupid. And if they hate us so much, maybe they should go someplace where there are no Americans, like Harvard, and stay out. Asshats. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture. What up, all you young dudes and dudettes? Today we're going to have a little civics lesson to make up for what you've been learning in school. This is your Constitution. This is your Constitution in Washington, D.C. Now, some of you youngsters may be wondering, Klavan on The Culture, what is this thing called the Constitution? And by the way, what's that cylindrical roll of white tissue? Well, let me answer your first question while standing very far away from you. The Constitution is a document written on crinkly brown paper by assorted men wearing wigs. These crinkly brown wig men were the descendants of other assorted crinkly people who were so desperate to escape from Europe, they crossed the ocean in rickety, unsafe vessels, lacking even the barest creature comforts, although the smarter ones avoided commercial airlines and just came over on ships. The new American crinklies were tired of living under European systems of government that allowed a small group of elites to lord it over ordinary people, instituting poorly conceived programs paid for by taxing the productive while they themselves sat around drinking their venti half-calf cinnamon mocha frappuccinos and passing off their opinions as facts in the New York Times of Europe. The question was, people love power. And once they get their hands on it, they won't willingly let it go, but will instead connive for more. Actually, that's not a question. In fact, there is no question about it. So, the Americans conceived a clever plan. Disguising themselves as white-haired old women, they dipped feathers in ink because if they were caught with pens, they'd be hanged by the British. Using these ink feathers, they wrote down laws intended to limit the powers of the government so the people's representatives wouldn't turn into corrupt, abusive, self-important busybodies, burdening the nation with intrusive legislation no one understands while spending money they don't even have. In Europe. The crinkly brown founders called these government-limiting laws the Constitution because they are what constitute America. You don't have to be a descendant of the original Whigmen to be an American. Even if you're elected president of the whole shebang, all you really have to do is preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution with its underlying philosophy of individual liberty, equal treatment, and limited government power. So, young people, since the Constitution is so important to our way of life, let's try to get a clearer understanding of how it works in specific cases. For instance, let's listen in as a CNSNews.com reporter asks Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi what constitutional provision grants Congress authority to force people to buy health insurance.
Are you serious? Are you serious?
Well, let's ask Congressman Phil Hare from Illinois.
I don't worry about the Constitution on this, to be honest.
Pete Stark, he's been a California congressman for more than 35 years. Pete, you don't pretend the Constitution lets the federal government do anything, do you?
The federal government, yes, can and do most anything in this country.
So, there you have your answer, which is that many of the people we trust with our government turn out to be just the sort of power-hungry lowlifes from whom the founding wig-wearers were trying to protect us. Now, perhaps some of you young folks are thinking in your hep groovy lingo, what's the big whoop? Chill, dude. Don't harsh my buzz. Unfortunately, I don't understand what you're saying and can't respond. But I can tell you that the freedom you enjoy today is the exception in history, not the rule. Grow complacent in its strength, ignorant of its foundation, or careless of the rules of its sustainment, and it will be lost to what James Madison called the gradual and silent encroachments of those in power. Dude. This is Andrew Klavan on The Culture.